The Samsung Galaxy Notes are unlike any other phone on the market. They have a lot of really great features like a square boxy design, the S Pen, and the countless S Pen gestures that are really uncontested by other phones. But the problem is the price. The Note 10 Plus is still selling for $1,100, and unless you want to buy a very outdated version, a lot of people won't be able to afford the Galaxy Note experience. That is, until recently, when Samsung released the Galaxy Note 10 Lite, which still has triple cameras, a large screen, the S Pen, and essentially everything people would be looking for in a Note at around half the price. But how well does this phone actually perform, and how can Samsung afford to sell this for half the price? In this video, I'll be testing out the Galaxy Note 10 Lite and answering those questions. Now, this phone offers essentially everything that the Galaxy Note 10 and Note 10 Plus offer at nearly half the cost. And on top of that, they added some very welcome features, such as the headphone jack on the bottom, and some unique differences about the camera that I'll mention later on in the video. And so starting off with the physical aspects of this phone, I want to look at first one of the most iconic Note features, the S Pen. And the S Pen on this phone is slightly different than the S Pen on the Note 10 Plus and the Note 10, and I'll mention that in a second. But you'll see on the bottom, if you just tap it, it clicks out, and you have the S Pen. You have some incredible features on here that really make the Note phone what it's known for. And so things like when the screen is off, you just write on the screen and take notes like that. You can doodle on things. You have AR doodle that you can use with the S Pen. You can control your camera. You can control slides on a presentation. You really have a lot of options by having the S Pen on the bottom of this phone. And it's something that I think a lot of people might be looking for, but the Note 10 and Note 10 Plus are just so much more expensive that this might be a pretty good option. Now, physically looking at this phone, on the back we have 4 cameras on a camera bump, which is arranged very differently than we saw on the Note 10 Plus, being that this is a little bit more like a block. But something really nice about this is that unlike the Note 10 and Note 10 Plus, this one is very, very shallow, and when you set it on a table, it has almost no camera wobble. Now, I know that's something we see on so many other phones, and typically we say that's not really a big deal, but on a Note phone, when you have an S Pen, it is actually kind of a big deal. If you're trying to write on a phone that's sitting flat on a table and it rocks back and forth, it definitely gets really annoying. So that's a big plus that this phone has right here, is that very shallow camera bump. Now on there, we have an ultra wide angle lens, we have a wide angle lens, and we have a telephoto lens, very similar to what we saw on the Note 10. And this one has all 12 megapixel sensors. Now on the front facing camera, what we have there is actually a 32 megapixel sensor. Again, this is something they're putting on a couple other, like the A51 and the A71. I don't know why you need 32 megapixels on a selfie camera, but maybe if you set up like a tripod somewhere and you take a gesture photo by raising your hand, maybe you could crop in after the fact. That's the only thing I could really think of. But regardless, you do have that on the front. Now, speaking of the front of this phone, we have a Super AMOLED screen, very large, 6.7 inches, and it's 1080 by 2400 pixels. It gets very bright, and honestly, I think this is a really, really good display, especially for a phone at this price point. Like I said, the top of this phone has a very small hole punch camera that is really not intrusive at all when you're watching videos or whatever you're doing with your phone. And then on the bottom, we have a fingerprint sensor underneath the display. And again, I really like to see this trickling down from flagship models. One small difference is that this is actually an optical fingerprint sensor, so it is flashing a small green light there. And I find that as far as fingerprint sensors go, it's not quite at the same caliber as the ultrasonic, so it's a little bit slower, a little bit less accurate, but it's still really nice to have an in-screen fingerprint sensor. On the top and bottom of this phone, we have the microphones, because you'll notice on the back there is no microphone next to the camera. So when you're taking a video, the audio quality might not be quite as high as the flagship versions. But on the bottom, we see we have a single speaker. Unlike some of the more flagship models where they have 2 speakers, this one is only using 1 when you're watching YouTube videos. So I'll test that out in a minute. Then we have the S Pen to the right, as I pointed out before. We have USB Type-C for charging and for anything else. It's capable of 25-watt fast charging through the USB Type-C right there. So it charges up very, very quickly. Then of course we have the headphone jack to the left of that, which is very nice to see considering really no flagship Samsung phones have the headphone jack anymore. Now on the back, we do not have wireless charging on here. One small drawback, and on top of that, being a more budget model, they didn't pay for an IP certification, so it technically is not rated for any water resistance. I wouldn't test that out to find out if it has any water resistance. This phone comes in 3 different colors that I really like a lot. So this one's the glow version where you turn it around and it just has kind of different colors in every angle of lighting. There's also a black and a red version. So on the left side, we have our dual SIM tray that also has an SD card slot in there as well. And it can house up to 1 terabyte of storage in case the 128 gigabytes on here was not enough for you. Now, talking about the internal specs of this phone, besides the 128 gigabytes of storage, you have the options for 6 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes of RAM. This also has a 4500 milliamp hour battery, which is the largest of any Note to date. Now, unfortunately, without a Snapdragon processor, the battery doesn't last as long as I would like it to, but I'm still easily getting through one day with really no problems at all, regardless of how much I use the phone. Some things you'll notice that are different from this compared to the Note 10 Plus, for example. First of all, the camera bump, as I pointed out, is very different in its arrangement and its protrusion. It also doesn't have a depth camera on here, and I'll test out the cameras in a minute and show you what the live focus mode looks like without a depth camera, see how good it works. And then probably the biggest difference mechanically is the general feel of this phone. So it's much less boxy, it doesn't have the overflow screen on the sides, and overall it feels a lot more rounded, similar to like the S series, for example. It's also reasonably heavy and it feels like a premium phone. It has aluminum bumpers all the way around, and on the back it does have plastic, even though it looks like glass. It is a plastic back, which some people like, some people dislike. Comment down below and let me know what you guys think of having a plastic back on your phone. Now, getting into the cameras, we'll test them out in a second, but like I said, on the back we have 3 cameras that are all 12 megapixels. On the front we have a 32 megapixel camera, and all of them are capable of recording in 4K. However, only the cameras on the back are capable of shooting 4K 60, so if you're looking for some slow motion 4K footage, you're gonna have to use the rear cameras. Now, starting with the ultra-wide lens, you can see there's a little bit of distortion in the edges, but otherwise the color in all 3 lenses generally looks very consistent, and the photos look very sharp, honestly. Looking at this photo right here, zoomed in on a flower, you can see that there's a really great color and really great saturation, as well as decent sharpness. Now, getting to the front-facing camera, despite having a really high resolution, I found that it looked a little bit on the grainy side, but the rear-facing camera, skin tones looked really good, and overall the photos looked really natural, with the zoomed in, with the wide angle, and even with the ultra-wide angle lens. And then getting into portrait mode with the front-facing camera, you can see that it did struggle to have some edge detection for the surroundings, like for example the bench right behind me as well as my shoulder. And then the rear camera, I think, did a fantastic job identifying not only the edges of myself, but the bench that I was sitting on and the post near me and a little bit behind me, and it blurred everything very well. Alright, so this is a video test with the front-facing camera. Leave a comment down below and let me know how this looks and sounds to you guys. And this is the rear-facing camera. There's a lot of ambient noise with sirens and stuff right now. I'm in a public park, but anyway, I think this looks pretty good. If we look at the sky, it looks pretty nice and warm up in the corners there. And if we just jump down and start looking at something closer, it's focusing really well, actually. Way better than the A series from my testing. Now, something that this does really well that the A series cannot do is actually zoom between different lenses. So if we zoom out, it goes out to the ultra wide, and we can zoom in and it'll transition right there to the primary, and then right about there transitions to the telephoto. And you can see there is definitely some difference in the color if you look at that during the zoom transition, but otherwise it looks pretty good. Even zooming in, I think it's a good, overall good camera. All right, now this is with steady mode on, so if you twist it or move up and down, it looks really good. So now let's get into a speaker test. Brand new active noise canceling TicPods. And normally I don't get excited about earbuds under $100 because most of them either suck or they're all so similar that... Alright, so a couple things you'll notice. First of all, it's nice that I can play and pause videos just by pressing the button on the S Pen. Second of all, you'll notice that the hole punch camera right there is actually really not that intrusive. And that's only when I zoomed in on YouTube. If you zoom out to the normal aspect ratio, it's completely hidden right on the side. Now, thirdly, the speaker on this is not going to be good enough for listening to music with any kind of decent quality, but if you're watching videos on YouTube, for example, I mean, it certainly gets the job done. All right, now let's test out the speed of the fingerprint sensor. You'll see it's located on the bottom of the screen, so if I just tap, it takes about half a second to sign in, and occasionally if I tap, I end up missing it or it doesn't work perfectly, but overall, it does a decent job. Now, I mentioned before that if you just take out the S Pen, you could write on the screen for some screen notes right here, and I want to test out the lag really quick, so let's go to a very thin pen. If you scribble around, you see that it's almost, I can't even notice any lag. It's really, really close, and it feels very natural. It's also pressure related, so if you press hard, or if you gently press, the line thickness changes. Now, as far as the processor goes on here, it's not a Snapdragon processor, but it's still octa-core, and I find that opening apps, it does a reasonable job. It opens them fairly quickly, and I didn't feel like it was holding me back at all. All right, now let's get into some of the pros and cons of using this phone. Now, starting off with the pros, I think that a lot of people really like having the classic shape here. It looks very similar to like the A51, the A71, the S20, and at the same time, having the S Pen somehow fit in that same body. I think a lot of people are really going to like that, because honestly, if you don't want to use the S Pen, it feels like a normal phone. And if you want to use the S Pen, you'll find that it is actually extremely useful, in my opinion, when you're trying to take notes, write things down, control your camera, for example. It has a lot of really cool features that just other phones don't have, because you don't have that S Pen in other phones. Now, another pro that they have on here is that it does literally have everything with OneUI, everything that you're seeing on the S20 or maybe the Note 20 when it comes out. And Samsung also promised to have real-time updates with this, so you'll be getting the same updates on this phone that you'll be getting on the S20 really at the same time. So that's really nice that you have that as well. And then of course we have the very large battery life, the excellent display, the excellent cameras. We have 3 cameras on the back, and probably the biggest pro that I found on this phone that is probably overlooked by a lot of people, honestly, is the lack of the camera bump on the back and the lack of the wobble when you set it down on a table, especially with the S Pen. That is really nice that they flattened that out, and I'm glad Samsung thought about that. Now, this phone is overall a very impressive phone, but of course there are a few drawbacks you should be aware of. Now, the first one is the S Pen is slightly different on this phone in comparison to the more premium models, and really the big difference is that it doesn't have the gestures that we saw with the Note 10 and Note 10 Plus. So for example, if you're trying to zoom in on the camera, I don't know if some people wanted to do that and use like the Harry Potter wand kind of deal. That does not work on here, but we do still have the button, of course, so you can take photos. If you double tap it, you can flip the camera around, but just keep in mind that you won't have those little Bluetooth air gestures that we saw on the Note 10 and Note 10 Plus. The lack of a depth camera could be a drawback for some people. Personally, I don't use AR Doodle. I also don't use live focus mode, so it really comes as no drawback to me at all. But otherwise, the lack of a curved display could maybe be a drawback for some people. It doesn't quite, like the bezels are a little bit visible, but it's kind of also a pro at the same time that you don't have the palm issue on the bottom. And then of course the lack of wireless charging, the water resistance rating, and using only a single speaker on the bottom. Those are all small drawbacks, but of course Samsung had to cut costs somewhere, and I think those are kind of the right places to cut costs. Although I would like to see a water resistance rating, being that the phone's like $500, so it would be nice to have that. So overall, the Samsung Galaxy Note 10 Lite. There's a lot of things that this phone obviously can't compete with the Note 10 and Note 10 Plus being the flagship version. So for example, the processor on this is not going to be competing with that. But there are also a lot of other things that this phone does better than the Note 10 and Note 10 Plus. So for example, having a headphone jack, having the flatter camera bump. Like, I think there's a lot of things that would make some people like this phone even more than the premium models, of course, as well as the price being significantly cheaper on this phone. So overall, guys, I highly recommend this phone. I think it's a great phone to use. Comment down below, let me know what you guys think of this, if you like it, if you don't like it, and overall what your thoughts are on the Samsung Galaxy Note 10 Lite. If you enjoyed this video, guys, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.